battlefield was hell. Smoke, blood, and men falling on all sides. But in the middle of that chaos, something shifted. I thought I was fighting the enemy, but the real fight, it was with time itself. We were supposed to be in Gettysburg, but when I woke up, the war had already ended. But this isn't the end. It's a loop, a nightmare, and I'm stuck in it. We've been here before, over and over, and now, the lights, the time, they're coming for me. I can't escape this war, because it never ended. The mud swallowed our boots as we marched. Gettysburg. The air was thick with gunpowder, sweat, and something else. Something foul, like rotting earth disturbed after too long beneath the surface. The vibrations rattled my ribs. My grip tightened around my musket, fingers slick with sweat. The night before battle always felt wrong, a kind of tension you could taste. But this was something else. Harper nudged me. His grin was forced, like a man bluffing in a game he knew he was losing. Think we'll live to see another sunrise? I almost laughed. Almost. Then, it happened. The war went silent. Not just a pause in gunfire. Everything. No wind, no distant shouts, no clinking of gear, no footsteps. Just nothing. I stopped mid-step, my breath catching in my throat. Harper froze too. His grin had disappeared. You hear that? His voice was barely above a whisper. I did, and I felt it too. Something was watching us. A weight settled on my chest, heavy, suffocating, like the very air had thickened around us. I gripped my musket tighter, my fingers locking around the wood. Then I heard it, a whisper. Too soft to make out, but close, right beside my ear. Cold sweat rolled down my spine. I spun around. Nothing. The battlefield stretched empty behind us. No figures, no movement. Just fog curling through the broken earth. Harper swallowed hard. Calloway. What the hell was that? I didn't answer, because I didn't know. A second whisper, louder now, moving. I took a step forward, but something was wrong. The mud that had clung to my boots moments ago was gone. The ground beneath me was dry, but it rained last night. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. Something had changed. Something was very, very wrong. Then, a scream, not a war cry, something else, something not human. Harper stumbled back, his breath hitching. I didn't dare move. The weight in the air pressed down harder, like unseen hands gripping my shoulders. The whisper came again, this time right behind me. I turned, musket raised. But there was still nothing there. The battlefield felt different, like something had shifted. The silence had returned, but now it wasn't just silence. It was absence. The kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Harper and I moved forward, stepping carefully over broken ground. The others pressed ahead, unbothered, unaware. The thick morning fog curled around us like grasping fingers. It swallowed shapes, distorted distances. Then, I heard it again. A whisper. I froze. The sound didn't belong here. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a voice. It was something in between. Harper must have heard it too. His fingers clenched around his rifle. "That's not the wind," he muttered. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The fog shifted ahead. Something moved in it. A shape. Tall, thin, barely visible. Harper stiffened. "You see that?" I did, but I wished I hadn't. The shape wasn't walking. It was gliding. No sound, No, wait, just a dark sliver cutting through the mist. My breath came shallow, muscles tensing as I gripped my rifle tighter. The shape hovered for a moment, then melted into the fog. Gone. Harper took a step back. We need to move. Now. I wasn't about to argue. We pressed forward, forcing ourselves to keep moving. My boots dragged against the ground. It felt heavier than before, like the earth itself was pulling me down. Then the whisper came again. Right behind me. I spun, rifle raised. Nothing. The fog was still. The battlefield unchanged. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was here with us, and it wasn't leaving. Harper's breathing was shallow. Mine wasn't much better. We picked up our pace, trying to catch up with the others. The air felt thicker now, heavy like it was pressing down on us. Every step forward felt like walking through wet sand. Then, something moved again. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. Harper grabbed my arm. "Calloway, look." Ahead of us, just beyond the fog, one of our men stood completely still. Too still. It was Collins. He wasn't moving. His musket was at his side, his back to us. The rest of the unit had passed ahead, yet he remained, like he had simply stopped in place. "Collins," Harper called. "You good?" No response. We walked toward him. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. Something about the way he stood, arms loose, head slightly tilted. It wasn't right. "Collins." I tried again. Still nothing. Then, just as we got within a few steps of him, he was gone. Not stepped away, not moved, just gone. Harper cursed under his breath. My blood ran cold. I stared at the spot where Collins had been, my mind scrambling for an answer. I took another step, waving my hand through the empty air. Nothing. There were no footprints where he had stood, no sign he had ever been there at all. Harper took a shaky breath. "Did you?" "Yeah." My throat was dry. I turned, rifle raised, but there was no one behind us, no movement. The whisper didn't stop this time. It grew louder, stronger. Not a single voice, but many, layered, whispering over one another. Words I couldn't understand. Then, Harper grabbed my sleeve. "Calloway, where's the unit?" I snapped my head up. They were gone. The soldiers ahead of us, McBride, Graves, the rest of them, had been just a short distance away. We should still be able to see them through the fog. But there was nothing. No figures, no movement, no sound. We were alone. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "They were right there," I whispered. Harper's fingers tightened around his rifle. So was Collins. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. We needed to get out of here. Now, Harper was gone. Not just missing, gone. Like Collins, like the rest of the unit had been moments ago. My stomach twisted as I scanned the fog, waiting for a shadow to reappear, for a voice to call out. But there was nothing, just silence and cold, empty space where he had stood. I turned back to the others, my breath coming fast. "Where's Harper?" My voice cracked. McBride frowned. "Who?" I froze. "Harper. Private Daniel Harper. He was just here." The men exchanged confused glances. Graves shook his head. "Calloway, we don't have a Harper in our unit." My pulse thundered in my ears. "That's not possible. We marched in together. I looked at McBride. "Sarge, you assigned him to my tent last week." McBride's expression hardened. "Calloway, get your head together. We're in the middle of a goddamn war." I opened my mouth to argue, but something stopped me. They weren't lying. They weren't messing with me. They genuinely didn't remember him. That night, when the others were asleep, I slipped into the command tent. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the unit roster. page after page, scanning each name. Nothing. Harper wasn't there. Not in this unit. Not anywhere. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. I gripped the papers tighter, my breath uneven. My best friend had vanished, not just from the battlefield, from memory, from records, from history itself. I turned the page again. A shadow shifted across the canvas of the tent. I looked up. McBride was standing at the entrance, watching. His voice was low. "What are you doing, Calloway?" I swallowed hard. "Just checking something." McBride stepped forward. His boots barely made a sound on the wooden floor. My fingers curled around the roster. I forced myself to breathe, to act normal, to ignore the cold, creeping feeling that I was the only one who remembered Harper ever existed. The camp felt different, wrong. I walked between the tents, my boots dragging against the dirt. The men were still here, talking, eating, sharpening bayonets. The war hadn't ended. The world hadn't stopped. But something had shifted. I searched for someone, anyone, who remembered Harper. The question sat heavy in my chest, but each time I opened my mouth, I hesitated. What would I even say? "Hey, do you remember the man who never existed?" I stopped outside my tent, rubbing my temple. My head was pounding. Then I noticed it. My uniform. The stitching looked wrong. The letters of my name, the patch over my chest, they were fading. I rubbed at it, hoping it was just dirt, just wear from the battle. But it wasn't. The letters weren't stained. They were disappearing, like ink washing away from a page. A sharp chill crawled down my spine. I swallowed hard and glanced around. No one else seemed to notice. Then a voice called behind me. "Private Calloway, right?" I turned, my pulse jumping. Graves stood there, his brow furrowed. That pause, that hesitation, it wasn't normal. "Yeah," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "Calloway." Graves nodded slowly. "Right, just checking." He walked on, but the unease in my gut only grew. I looked down at my uniform again. The patch was even fainter than before. I stumbled back a step, gripping my head. If this continues, will I forget myself? I couldn't sit still anymore. My mind raced with the images of Harper's absence, the whispering voices, the vanishing men. I had to find answers. No one else would help me. The others were too caught up in the battle, too focused on the fight. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I slipped out of camp, making my way through the fog-drenched woods. Every step felt heavier than the last, the earth beneath me almost pulling me back. But I pushed on. The trees around me felt wrong. They seemed to shift subtly, their shadows stretching at odd angles, like they were watching me. The night was suffocating, and every snap of a twig beneath my boots sounded far too loud in the dead silence. I crept forward, my musket tight in my grip. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Answers, yes, but also a way out. Then I heard it. A rustle in the underbrush. I froze. Before I could react, a Confederate soldier jumped out of the shadows, slamming me to the ground with surprising strength. My musket flew from my hands, landing somewhere in the dirt. The cold barrel of his rifle pressed against the back of my head. "You move, I shoot." His voice was gruff, but there was something in his tone. Fear. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the gun as his breath brushed against my ear. Then, instead of pulling the trigger, he eased up just slightly. His grip loosened on my collar, and I felt the rifle drop just enough. His voice came again, quieter this time, almost a whisper. "You see them too, don't you?" I blinked, my pulse still racing. "See who?" His eyes widened, and he nodded towards the invisible horizon. "They are watching us too." For a moment, We just sat there in the dark, our breaths sinking in the eerie silence. I wanted to tell him he was crazy, that I had lost my mind along with Harper and the others, but I couldn't. I knew he wasn't lying. There was something in the air, watching, waiting. Then, the sky split open, not literally, but for a split second, a strange, unnatural glow flickered in the distance, brighter than any stars. It wasn't natural. It wasn't even from the campfires. We both turned toward it, eyes wide. Then, the glow vanished, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't speak. I couldn't. But I knew one thing for sure. This war, this wasn't just about us. It was about something bigger. The Confederate led me deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around us like a tunnel. The fog had thickened, and the air felt colder, heavier. We were far from the battle, and I felt a strange sense of isolation. It wasn't safe, not by a long shot, but it was the only place I could think of where we might get answers. He stopped in front of an old abandoned farmhouse. The building stood crooked and worn, like it had been forgotten by time itself. The house looked untouched by time, dusty, but not rotting. The kind of preservation you'd expect in an untouched place, but something about it felt off. We entered, and the scent of aged wood and dampness filled the air. It was quiet inside, too quiet, like the house had been waiting for us. Inside, we found a collection of strange artifacts, dog tags, worn and rusty, uniforms, faded but well kept, and old photos pinned to the walls. They were a strange mix of relics from different wars, from different eras. I paused by a box of dog tags. One of them caught my eye, from a soldier named Thompson. I couldn't place the face, but something about the name triggered something in me. The Confederate didn't speak. He just nodded, motioning for me to look further. I lifted a photograph from the stack, dated 1917. The uniforms didn't belong to the Civil War. They weren't even from this era. They were modern. I turned it over. It said, "The Great War, next battlefield." Another photo, this one from 1944. The soldiers were in familiar World War II uniforms, but something in their faces was wrong. They weren't from the past. They looked too alive. I didn't dare look at the next one, but I did. It was 2023, modern-day soldiers in full gear. I dropped the photo back into the box, my mind scrambling for an explanation. This didn't make sense. The wars these soldiers fought weren't even here yet. Then I heard it, a low hum. It started in the air, barely audible at first, like the sound of a distant engine. But then it grew. The house shook, the walls creaking in protest. The lights flickered. They were back. This time, they were different, more powerful, more focused, like they knew we were here, knew we were looking for answers, and then, nothing. The lights were gone, but something was still there, watching. It wasn't just erasing men, it was rewriting time itself. I didn't have time to think. All I could do was run. The Confederate and I dashed through the forest, the ground beneath us uneven and treacherous. Every step felt like it pulled us deeper into something we weren't meant to understand. The lights were right behind us. The pulsing glow grew brighter, and with it, the weight in the air pressed harder on my chest. I glanced over at the Confederate, his face a mirror of my own panic. We were being chased, but by what? The lights, the force that had already claimed so many men, or something even worse. Then, it happened. We ran straight into another clearing. The fog parted just enough for us to see it. The farmhouse. The same farmhouse we had just left. but it was different. The door still hung open, its frame warped and cracked. The vines that had once covered it were now pulled back, revealing more of the stone beneath. But something was off. The angle was wrong. The trees around it seemed closer, like we had run in a circle. But how could we? I took a step forward, heart hammering. No, this isn't possible. I grabbed the Confederate's arm. We have to go, now. We burst through the door and into the same room we'd entered hours ago. The same familiar smell of dust and decay. The same pile of dog tags and scattered photos. But everything felt wrong. I was searching for answers, trying to make sense of it all. Then, my eyes caught something that made my heart skip a beat. Scrawled in frantic script on the farmhouse wall. Run. We have been here before. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back. I knew that handwriting. I knew it, because it was mine. I turned around to say something to the Confederate, but when I did, he was gone. No sound, no trace. He had vanished, like Harper, like the others. I took a step forward, scanning the room, but the walls were empty now. No sign of him, no sign of any man who had ever been there. I gripped my head, the room spinning around me. The farmhouse had been a warning, a trap. But more than that, it was a cycle. A place where time didn't just break, it reset. The farmhouse stood silent around me, like a tomb. I wasn't sure what to do anymore. It felt like my mind was unraveling, each thought slipping away into an abyss I couldn't see, but could feel tugging at the edges of my consciousness. I ran my hand over the walls, desperate for some sort of explanation, but every corner I turned only led me further into confusion. The same rooms, the same stale air. But this time, there was a sense of heaviness that wasn't there before. Then I heard it. A footstep. Not mine. I spun around, eyes wide. My rifle was still in my hands, but it felt useless now. And there, standing in the doorway, was me. The other Calloway. His face was pale, his eyes cold, but it was unmistakable. It was me. I was staring at myself. But this version of me was different. His eyes were hollow, like he had been here too long, trapped in a loop. "Who the hell are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the room, his movements deliberate, like he knew exactly where to go. He raised a hand, motioning for me to follow. I stood frozen. Was this some kind of trick? Was it another ghost, another figment of my breaking mind? Then he spoke. His voice was my own, but the words were wrong. "They're coming for you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. He turned his back to me, walking toward the far wall. He ran his hand over the surface, the same way I had done earlier. But something was different. I felt a pull toward him, like the walls themselves were closing in, and I needed to know what he knew. Without thinking, I followed. And as I stepped closer, I saw it. The walls began to warp. The edges of the room bent, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. The air thickened again, like time itself had decided to stop moving. My other self stopped, turning to face me. The cold, empty eyes locked with mine, and for a split second, I felt the weight of everything. His voice was almost a whisper. "You're never getting out." Then, the lights flickered. They were back again. But this time, the hum was different, stronger, and just as quickly, he was gone. I ran. My legs burned, my breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. The farmhouse, the walls, the very earth beneath me, it was all collapsing. Everything was falling apart, and I was just trying to escape. The lights, the force, The things that had been watching us. It was coming for me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I just needed to get out. The walls around me trembled, and the ground beneath me buckled. The sky twisted into jagged lines, glitching in front of my eyes. One moment, I was back at Gettysburg, the battlefield around me, the sounds of war deafening. The next, it was something else. A landscape I didn't recognize. The trees, the hills, they all warped, melted into shapes that shouldn't exist. I stumbled, my mind spinning, and then, a blinding white flash. Everything went white. I fell to my knees, the world spinning in circles around me. Then, nothing. A cold wind passed over me, and I took a sharp breath. Silence. I opened my eyes. My head throbbed, and for a moment I didn't know where I was. It felt like I had woken from a dream, but everything was too still, too quiet. The war was gone. The battlefield, the screams, the chaos. It was all gone. I pushed myself to my feet. There was no sign of the fight, no remnants of soldiers or blood, just peace. I looked around. The field stretched out before me, quiet and undisturbed. In the distance, a farmhouse stood against the horizon. The colors were too bright, too clean, but something felt wrong. I stumbled forward, unsure of where I was, and began walking toward a small town in the distance. As I neared, I saw people moving around, living their normal lives. They didn't notice me, didn't seem to care. I approached an old man on the street. "Excuse me," I said. "Where's my regiment?" I was with them. "Where are the other soldiers?" He looked at me blankly, as if he didn't understand the question. "I'm sorry, son. I don't know what you're talking about." I asked a few more people, and the answers were all the same. No one had heard of my regiment. No one had ever heard of any soldiers like us. I ran to the records office, desperate, but the same story played out. There were no names, no units, no history. The war had never happened, not the way I remembered. I sat down in the middle of the quiet town, my head spinning. Everything was fine, everything was normal, but none of it was real. I was alone in a world that never remembered me. I sat there in the middle of the town, feeling the weight of the silence press in from every direction. The world was quiet, too quiet. The air had a sense of stillness, a peace that should have been comforting, but instead, it was suffocating. My chest tightened with every breath, the unease crawling under my skin. I wandered through the streets, my feet carrying me forward without purpose, the sun shining far too brightly, as if mocking the madness in my mind. Every corner I turned led to the same realization. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be alone. I stopped by a small store, the windows clean, the shelves lined with goods that seemed too well maintained for a war-ravaged world. Inside, the owner, a middle-aged man with an almost empty expression, was polishing a countertop. I cleared my throat, trying to sound as calm as possible. "Excuse me, sir. I'm looking for my regiment, the 23rd Infantry. Have you seen any records of them?" He stopped for a moment, his hands frozen mid-motion. He looked at me blankly, his face unchanging. "You said the 23rd Infantry?" he asked, his voice as flat as his expression. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. I've lived here my whole life. Never heard of them." My stomach dropped, the room spinning around me. This couldn't be happening. I took a step back, glancing at the shelves. There were books on the history of the town, a few on military records. None of them mentioned anything about the regiment I had been part of. Nothing about Gettysburg or the war. I didn't have time to argue. I turned and walked out, my mind racing. If they weren't here, if they were gone from history itself, what had happened? I couldn't even remember how long I had been running. Time seemed to blur, but I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to be in this quiet place. I ran back to the edge of the town, hoping, praying I would see something familiar. Anything that could tell me what was real, what wasn't. But the farther I went, the more I realized nothing was real anymore. The town wasn't real. My regiment wasn't real. I wasn't real. I couldn't stay in the town any longer. The questions were eating at me. How could this all be happening? The memories, the war, the people who vanished. How could it all be gone so quickly, so completely? I walked aimlessly, hoping for some kind of sign. The world felt like a painted backdrop, too clean, too artificial. The peaceful air suffocated me. My legs carried me into a forest where the trees grew thicker, their trunks leaning closer as though trying to trap me. The fog was back, heavier this time, curling around me like fingers. It felt familiar. This wasn't the first time I had walked through this forest, but I hadn't been here before. The trees seemed to whisper, their branches creaking under an invisible weight. And then, I saw it. The farmhouse. But something was different. It was dark now. The windows were cracked, the door slightly ajar. The scent of decay hung in the air, not the quiet peace I'd felt before. I stepped closer. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from realization. The farmhouse wasn't just some random place. It was a checkpoint, a reset point in this warped timeline. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I had to know. I crossed the threshold, my breath catching in my throat. The interior was empty, eerily still, like the rest of the world had forgotten this place too. But I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me, pulling at my thoughts. I glanced at the walls. My handwriting was still there. Run. We have been here before. But now, the words seemed different, more distant. The ink was fading, the message losing meaning. I stepped further into the house. The floorboards groaned under my feet, but something was off. The house had shifted again. It wasn't the same one I had entered. It felt older now, as though it had lived through decades, not just days. The walls flickered, their surfaces warping as time folded in on itself. I caught a glimpse of something, a figure, a soldier, standing at the far end of the room, his back to me. His uniform wasn't from the Civil War. It was a modern soldier's uniform, a new recruit. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I turned around. The lights came back on, but this time, they didn't just flicker. They swept across the room, moving fast, flashing like a warning. I closed my eyes. I could feel the walls closing in, the room shifting around me. Time was fracturing again. Then the voice came, soft, almost a whisper, but louder this time. You were never here. It was my voice, my own words, echoing through the house, bouncing off the walls, like a memory I couldn't escape. I opened my eyes, but everything was different now. The farmhouse was gone. The world had changed.